All right, so if you'd like to follow along with the video, you can continue to watch. If you'd prefer to look at the slides independently, you can do that as well. So, Persepolis is a graphic novel that is also a memoir, and it's also very heavily rooted in history. So, throughout the entire memoir, you are thrust into the history of the Islamic Revolution. And this is a really key part of Iran's history. And as we're reading the memoir, you're going to see a lot of the history coming up in the background. And it's pretty important to have some sense of what the Islamic Revolution is and also what led into it, because a lot of Marjane's life is going to be in the forefront of this history in Iran. So the memoir is going to focus on her life from age 6 to age 14. And during this time, we have this period where the Shah is overthrown in Iran, the Islamic Revolution succeeds, and the war with Iraq devastates the country. So the Islamic Revolution has its roots in Iran's history. So essentially, you can't understand 1978 to 1979 when the Islamic Revolution takes place without having an understanding of the political history of the country, beginning, at least for us, in 1921. So in 1921, the United Kingdom helps Reza Shah Pahlavi establish a monarchy in Iran. And 20 years later, in 1941, the UK decides to push Reza Shah into exile, and his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, takes the throne. Mohammad Reza Shah is an important part of history because as he takes over, he ends up dismissing parliament and he begins this very aggressive modernization of the country while simultaneously destroying the wealth and influence of landowners and clerics. So you're going to see this shift in Iran from a largely rural economy to an urban economy pretty quickly. And those who had prospered in that rural economy are going to be the ones who end up not prospering quite as much under Muhammad Shah. And that's where you'll see a lot of root of the problems that do come about later on. So the modernization really disrupts the rural economy. By the 1970s, opposition grows due to high rates of inflation in Iran that threatens the buying power and ultimately the standard of living of people in Iran. So 1970 is about 30 years later, after the Shah takes over. And pretty quickly, political tensions rise. So political opposition parties during this time were not allowed to exist. Political participation was minimal, and you did have social and political protests that came up, but oftentimes they were censored or would result in torture or illegal detention. So as time goes on, many more people become pretty dissatisfied with the Shah's close ties to the United States and Israel. A lot of people are very dissatisfied with his commitment to westernizing Iran and using the Western influence and applying that to Iran. And they see an Iran that's quite different from the one that they knew 30 years ago before the Shah came to power. So from afar, a lot of people would have said that Iran looked to be doing well, especially economically as a country. But in only a few decades, Iran had shifted from a more traditional conservative rural society to a more modernized urban society. So you have to think about who gets left behind. Those rural farmers, those landowners, a lot of those individuals are no longer prospering in this modernized Iran. And in addition to that, the conservative traditional country that was once known to many of these people no longer looks the same. So a lot of Western influence coming into play. And for a lot of people, this was something that was extremely problematic and leads to growing discontent. There was a sense in Iran that basically the government had failed to deliver on all that was promised and failed to maintain the tradition of the country. So anti-regime protests ultimately begin, and Khomeini is a name that you'll see often if you look into the Islamic Revolution history. So Khomeini was a political revolutionary, a really big name in terms of his encouragement of opposition, and he ultimately calls for the Shah's abdication of the throne, so, giving up the throne. So the Shah and his family flee the country ultimately in 1979, and at that point, Khomeini, who had been living in exile at the time, returned to Iran in February, and by April of 1979, he's declared Iran is an Islamic Republic. So in this Islamic Republic, conservative social values are enforced. The Family Protection Act, which had been in place under the Shah and had granted more rights to women, is declared void and dissolved. Islamic codes of dress and behavior are enforced by guards patrolling the streets. and there's an informal religious militia formed. So there's a return to the tradition and conservatism that you saw prior to the Shah coming in and modernizing and really straying away from some of those traditions towards westernization. So under Khomeini, there's a really strong attempt to end all Western influence. And at this time, many of the educated people in Iran flee. A new religious government is formed, and more moderate leaders, in fact, some of those who would have been considered to be quite conservative, if they were too much on the moderate side, they were actually forced from power. So Khomeini just determined that only the most conservative leaders would be in power, and he becomes the first Rahbar or leader of this regime.